Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. I'm your host, Mott Tuman, and thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to be talking all about portrait painting with a brand new brush that we just got in here at JerrysArtarama. But before I get into any of that, tonight's class code is JL309. So if you go to JerrysArtarama.com and type in that code into the search bar, the teacher's cart will come up with all the supplies I will be using tonight. So you have questions about anything that I'm using, if you want to check out any of the supplies, that's where you need to go to find all of this. But yeah, let's get right into it. This was actually a request after a previous show that I had done, which was figure painting with watercolors. We're doing watercolors again tonight, but portrait painting. So we're getting to that side of things. But I'm going to be painting this nice lady tonight, or we're not on the overhead yet, so I have to hold it up here. We're going to be painting this nice lady tonight. But before I get into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the structures of the face. Because if you've never done a lot of portrait painting before, thinking about how to kind of map out the different angles and structures of the face are going to really help you when it comes to painting, even if you're not, if you're just doing something straight from a reference, you're not creating your own portrait per se. Mapping out the structures can help a lot. So if we do go to the overhead now, I'm going to show you guys really quickly. I got our New York Central watercolor paper that we're going to be working on here. I got my reference for this lovely lady. So I'm going to show you guys real quickly. These are a bunch of different reference images that I printed out, and I was kind of mapping out the structures of their faces with just a white marker and like trying to plan out exactly what is happening on their facial features. So if you have a reference like the one that we're using here tonight, and you want to make sure that you're getting all the proportions and everything correctly, this is something that's really going to help you, is just sketching over the key features and the key kind of like the typography of the face when you think about it, and then almost copying that structure directly onto paper. So if I show you guys really quickly, I'm going to show you guys how I use this to help draw one of these faces before we get into watercolors, just so you guys, if you're doing your own sketch at home, you can kind of plan out how you're gonna get the structure and everything right. Whew. It's really cold here. My fingers are still warming up, so if I'm like finicky or like if I'm dropping this pencil a lot, it's because my hands are freezing, so bear with me tonight. Okay, but you can see here, this is how I mapped out the structure of this man's face. There's lots of different ways you can do this. In fact, if you like Google really quickly, image search for like facial structures or how to draw different facial structures, you can see that everyone kind of does it a slightly different way. So how you ultimately do this depends on your preferences and how you want to depict someone's face. This is how I do it, so this is how I'm going to show you tonight. What I do is essentially, I depict, our general circle for the head as people do. This is going to be, I'm going to draw this pretty dark so you guys can see it well, since I'm drawing a little bit small right now. So I mapped out basically the circle of the head. So generally when we want to think about faces, it's kind of like our skull is a really simplified skull, and then you kind of have the plane of your face that's wrapping around that circle. So if this is like a profile of someone, this is the front of their face, maybe I have their nose right here, and then maybe their ear would probably be right around on the side of their head right there. And then we'd have the neck, that kind of, it doesn't go straight down, it kind of comes out at an angle. This is a very simplified version of a face right here. You can kind of see, we always kind of start out with, there's a gnat flying around, so excuse me. Start out with this circle, as a lot of people do. So I kind of found on my structure here where the general shape of this man's head is, kind of ignoring the structure of his face, and then I planned out where the plane of his face would be relative to that. And once I got those two shapes, which are probably the most important, it's just that plane, and he's slightly at an angle, so I'm going to make sure that this plane of the face is also slightly angled instead of facing straight on. After that is when you can kind of get into the specific details that are going around. So I always like, right after this stage, to focus on where the ears are. I kind of like to use the ear as a landmark, especially if you're doing a face that's in a really tricky perspective. Your ear can really kind of help audiences key into where the face is kind of moving, especially if you're drawing someone from the back of their head. That back of the ear is going to kind of indicate a bit better what the facial features look like without, drawing them in exactly. So I got my ear right there, and then the ear is also a really handy tool to be able to figure out where the rest of the facial features are placed. So generally, this varies from person to person depending on what their facial features are. Again, bear with me. But you can see right here, he's got the top of his eyebrows right there, and it kind of almost curves around into the top of the ear. That's kind of how I like to think about it, is that the top of the ear generally matches up with the top of your eyebrows. So I'm gonna kind of draw a curved line from the top of that ear in, and then I'm also gonna make sure I find the center line of the face where all the other features are gonna be based around. And then after that, you're just building in the other features. So I like to put emphasis on this little bridge here that's right between the eyes. I'm really pointing to my face right now, I realize, but you guys are looking down here, so if you see me in the little picture-in-picture, I'm like motioning to them on my own face. But you can see right here, I like to emphasize this little bridge between the eyes, so I'm gonna put that area in right there. And then we have his nose that's coming out. And I basically just break it down into like boxier shapes. Really simplify things so I'm not getting too bogged down in the details. Something you really want to think about is this angle on the bottom of your nose. I find that part really kind of trips me up sometimes because I have a very pointy nose, and sometimes I, think of noses as very triangular, but they're really more square and boxier. And so this underside of the nose really is key to getting the perspective right on this, especially since we're looking at him from a slightly lower angle. So make sure I get that in correctly. And then the rest of it is just following the rest of his features. So kind of like the cave of the eyes. The cave of the eyes? That doesn't really make sense. The way that your eyes kind of angle inward. So you got your brow bone, and then your eyes are kind of situated in that little socket of your skull. So they tend to have a little bit, if things are being lit from above, they tend to be in shadow just a little bit. And so I like to emphasize that little box where the eyes are kind of recessed in a bit. And then after that, I kind of like to use the structure of the eye to figure out where my cheekbones are that come down in the face, and where the plane of the face here kind of deviates from the front of his face to the side of his face on this little triangle. And generally, I like to depict it as kind of a diamond or a triangular shape. Again, every facial feature that you see is gonna vary a little bit. So you can see here, like, her eyes are a lot closer, the bridge for her nose is a lot tighter, but this side of her face is a bit wider than his, or not really wider, but maybe longer. She has a more narrow face, so the sides of her face are a bit longer. And everyone's face varies a little bit. Like, she has a much pointier nose than him, so it's gonna stick out a bit farther, and she's at a much more quarter, 3/4 turn, rather than not quite as straight on as him. So her nose is pointing out a little bit more prominently, but we can still see this very edge of the face over here, where this shape is on the other side. And so little things like that are kind of what mapping the structure out like this will help you see. It will help you really get the perspective on the face and the proportions correct. So going back to our ear, I also want to point out that one way I like to map it out is that the bottom of the ear generally lines up with the bottom of the nose. Another easy way to think about. And then in terms of drawing the mouth, I always like to think of where the corners of the mouth line up with the eyes. And this varies a lot from person to person, and depending on what facial features they have, they could be smiling, they could be frowning, and their mouth could be like drastically different sizes. So that varies a lot, but I like to pay attention to like his corner of the mouth kind of lined up with this part of his eye. And so I'm going to pay attention to that when I'm sketching it out right here, is that I'm going to make sure the corner of his mouth is a little bit beyond the edge of his nose, but a little not too far into where the eye is. So that's kind of how you begin sketching things out. I'm not going to go too in-depth into that because I want to focus mostly on actually painting with watercolor, because I know a lot of people get frustrated with getting small details or depicting skin tones and things like that clearly when they're working with watercolor. So I'm going to be focusing on that, but if you do have any questions about the structure of the face and how you can deal with perspective when you're looking at someone's face, feel free to ask me in the comments. I will be happy to answer those questions. But that is a very helpful tool if you're struggling with that at all. Is something to think about. But I have this reference picture here, which I chose specifically because she has these really prominent facial features, and like her face has a really prominent shape to it. And I think that helps a lot when you're first starting out with portraiture. is to find someone that has like really prominent facial features, because it will help you think a bit more on how to paint three-dimensionally. Even though we're painting on a two-dimensional surface, like we did over here, thinking about the face three-dimensionally is really gonna help you paint it more realistically. And even if you're not painting realism per se, if you're doing cartoons or anything like that, thinking about how your structure is gonna look three-dimensionally is gonna help you depict it in a more believable way. So I think I'm gonna get right into painting here. I have New York Central watercolor paper here. I have our Marie's Master watercolors up here, and the colors I've poured out, you can see I was using this a little bit earlier, so it's just a little messy, but I have lemon yellow and alizarin crimson and then an ultramarine that I have right here as kind of my primaries. And I decided just to use primaries for this because when I'm doing portraiture and I'm trying to get skin tones accurately, I don't really like to use convenience colors, which are, you know, pre-mixed colors for your convenience, because I feel like they don't always accurately represent skin tones. So I really like to start out from primaries. And yeah, and we're gonna be working with Oasis brushes, which these are the new brushes that I mentioned at the beginning of these shows. Blah, blah, blah. At the beginning of this show. They're vegan synthetic brushes, but they're really excellent for watercolor because they hold a ton of water. And I even want to show you guys, because this kind of trips me out, if we can go to the dynamic really quickly. Like, they're synthetic brushes, but the bristles even have, they're meant to mimic natural hair, if I can get this in shot. And the bristles even have like that little bit of, let me see if I can actually get it into the camera here. Nope. Okay. They even have like that slight little curve to them that natural hairs do. If you can see the little bit of waviness, which I don't know how they got that in a synthetic brush, but it trips me up when I look at it because it really feels and looks like natural hair. So we can go back to the overhead here. I like these brushes because they hold a ton of water, which is really helpful for what we're doing tonight because we're going to be doing large washes of this. I always start out my portraiture with super large, even washes of color, and I always like to start out with the lightest lights in my painting. So we're going to be starting out with our highlights right here. Okay. Now we're going to think a little bit about how we're going to mix this person's skin tone. Now, I'm actually going to bring my reference image up here so you guys can see it a bit better. But the top of her face is in shadow, and then the bottom of her face is really warmly lit by the sun. So we're going to mix a very warm skin tone for her to kind of go over this lower half first. And I'm just going to focus on the bottom half that's not in shadow for now, and then after that I'm going to come back in with this shadowy area. So I'm going to take, I think, predominantly lemon yellow, and then can someone, oh wait, no. I almost thought I forgot a rag, but I got a rag right here, so we're good. I'm going to start out with lemon yellow, and then I'm going to make sure this is a very warm orangey color. So I'm going to make sure lemon yellow and red, or alizarin crimson, are my dominant colors for this mixture. And then I'm just going to have the tiniest bit of ultramarine, just so we're not working with a super intense orange, because there's not many people out there whose skin tone is a super intense orange. So I'm going to make sure it's really bright and warm, and these brushes hold a ton of water. So I'm going to make sure I get a nice little wash right there. And I might even add a bit more paint to it, because you want to start out light, but I find that lots of times watercolors dry a bit lighter than it looks when you put it down wet. So I'm going to make sure it's a little bit darker than I think I want it to be, because I always paint it out and then it ends up being slightly too light. So I gotta compensate for my assumptions. Okay, and then the tiniest bit of ultramarine. I don't want to go too hard so that the skin tone doesn't come out muddy. And actually, I think that did come out muddy. You could see too, like, this brush absorbed all of that so quickly. So a bit more red in there and a bit more yellow. And I'm actually going to use, I find this is really helpful if you get a spray bottle like this when you're making washes, so that you don't have to be carrying your brush from your water basin to your palette over and over and over again. And I'm going to squeeze some of that pigment out so I can make sure I get an accurate wash. And I think that's what I want. So I'm going to soak this up really quickly. And key thing to think about when you're going in with your first wash is that you don't want to be scrubbing at the paper. You really want to go kind of side to side, work it down, not go over and over parts again and again, but really kind of work it piece by piece. And I'm gonna make sure I sketch this out very detailed, much more detailed than I would normally, mainly because this is live painting, and if any of you have ever done live painting, you get nervous and you forget tiny details. So I like to sketch things out a little more detailed than I normally would when I'm not painting on live. But the helpful part about this is that I can get those really crisp lines of the shadow. And since this woman has a lot of facial texture and a lot of wrinkles, those really crisp, clean edges are gonna kind of help bring out those more textured areas. Even though if I was painting someone a bit younger, I might not want really jagged lines like that. So I'm gonna make sure I'm not going over those edges too much. And the benefit of having a brush that can hold a lot of water when you're painting like this is that it's gonna help you get very consistent washes. I have a little bit pigment right there. You'll see too, sometimes when you're working on cold pressed paper, I'm gonna hold this up so you guys can see it, you'll get almost like pigment collecting in the little pits and textures of the paper. Don't worry about that too much because most of the time as it dries, that will kind of even out. So that's a head up if you really like working with cold press or rough paper. And I'm even gonna get the edge of her ear right here. Okay, we got most of her face in light and she has a little bit of her neck right there, so I'm just gonna hint at that. And then I'm gonna immediately start going in. This is kind of like the base tone of what I think her skin will look like. I'm gonna start going in and kind of adding warmer and cooler tones, and I'm gonna even pull out some of this tone here to suggest she has these really bright highlights on her cheeks and her nose. So I'm gonna pull out some of that paint, so I have in mind where her highlights are gonna be. And she even has a little bit on her lips here. And a little bit down here. I'm not worried about, I don't really wanna leave those pure white, because like no one's skin tone is gonna be that bright. And you'll see as I start darkening up her skin a bit more that those yellowish highlights are gonna start to look a little bit more natural in comparison with the white paper. So I'm just leaving them light, and I'm gonna come in here. Got a little bit of dust on my painting, so I gotta pull that out really fast. And I think I'm gonna immediately start coming in with a bit of warmer reds and kind of start hinting at these. She's got these very, what is it? It's like you got apple cheeks. There's a phrase that I'm forgetting right now where it's like you got like apples for cheeks or something. I'm really blinking. They're giving me funny looks because they don't know what I'm talking about. But it's like you have those really rosy round cheeks. She's got that. So I'm gonna make sure I get that kind of blush line going to start emphasizing the very round shape of her cheeks that she's got going here. So I'm gonna mix my alizarin crimson in a bit more, make sure I get a little more yellow in there. Maybe even a bit more alizarin crimson, so it's got that rosy feel. And I'm gonna go in while this is still wet, and I'm just gonna start kind of shaping her face, really sculpting it out, thinking of it as something that's more three-dimensional. And this is really important to do while this is still wet. You're working wet and wet. You're not trying to get details, you're just trying to get the general shapes of the face. And if it starts drying up a little bit, you can do what I just did, which is squirt it just a little bit with a water mister. That's the word I'm looking for right now. Squirt it just a little bit with a water mister to keep it wet. One thing to keep in mind is you don't really want to do that when you start getting into details, because that will smear your details and it might even add a little bit of texture into your paint. But while you're doing just large washes like this, it's okay. Well, it's always okay. You can do whatever you want. But if you don't want to get your details all washed out, don't do that. Okay. I'm even gonna start suggesting, she has this bright red shirt on and it's kind of reflecting that red light up on her face into the shadows on the lower end of her face. So I'm even gonna start suggesting some warmer tones towards the bottom of her face and even in these like pits of her cheeks right here where she's smiling and the shadows kind of start to form. And I'll even get a little bit under her nose and along like the tip of her nose that's in shadow, and really just like sculpting things out. Always try to think of things three-dimensionally, even though we're painting on a two-dimensional surface. So I'm kind of starting to suggest that I need a little bit of warmer tones right up here where her nose is kind of like crinkling in, or like this part of her face. is coming down. I'm gonna get a little bit of that, where like the eye is kind of caving in and curving into the nose. And then even a little bit up here, she's got a little bit of wrinkles on the bridge of her nose. And this is just our final, this is not our final, this is just our first, opposite of final, layer of color. So this is gonna continue to evolve. It's kind of like the underpainting of our watercolor. So we're gonna continue to add on to this and continue to darken things up and add more color as we go. But since we got that bottom half done, I wanna jump up into the top half before we get too far and start getting that shadow developing. And since this top half is in shadow, I wanna make it just a little bit cooler to really stand out against the shadows that are being reflected from her shirt, because I think these shadows are a bit warmer, and then this shadow up here, I wanna paint a little bit cooler. But this is kind of the tricky part here. There are still areas of her face in the shadow that have a lot of depth to them. Like her eyes here, they're really concaved. There's a lot of separation between her eyes and the bridge of her eyebrows and her forehead. And I want to make sure that I don't just paint this as like one solid color. I just realized I put my reference picture like right on top of my painting. Don't do that. That left a little bit of a mark there, but we're only on the first layer, so it's okay. So I'm gonna start mixing in my shadow right here. And really, I'm gonna move this over because I'm right-handed and I'm mixing on the left side, which is completely unnecessary to be pulling this across my painting every single time. So I'm gonna situate this a little bit differently. There we go. And then I'm gonna start working on the shadow. So I'm gonna make sure I get a bit more ultramarine in there. And this Marie's ultramarine is really nice because it granulates beautifully, which I love when I'm doing people with more textured skin. And even people without textured skin, I love granulating. But keep in mind, if you want someone with a really smooth skin tone and things to be really even, you want to avoid granulating colors like an ultramarine, which is typically granulating. You probably want to go more for like a phthalo-cyanine kind of color. Okay, I'm going to get my ultramarine in there, and I'm even going to make it maybe a little bit purpley, because I don't want this to be a straight blue. So I'm going to mix a bit of my alizarin crimson, and then a tiny bit of lemon yellow. And I like to, this brush soaks up all of your color, so I like to run it on the edge of my palette so it kind of pools down back into what I was doing. Getting a little bit more ultramarine there. This is really the thing with mixing primers, is that it's just kind of push and pull and seeing if I can get the exact ratios of color that I want. Okay. I think that's a bit closer to what I want. It's more of a warmer, it's still cool, purpley tone. I'm gonna get a little bit more water on my brush, but it really absorbed all of that. And I'm just gonna go straight into painting this. And this is already mostly dry, so I'm not too worried about that. And I'm even going to paint straight over the eyes. Typically, you might want to leave the whites of the eyes out when you're doing this kind of thing, 'cause you don't want them to be dark like the rest of the face, but her face is really in shadow here, and I can't even really see the whites of her eyes particularly well. So I'm just gonna paint right over them. Just make sure I get that whole base of the shadow in. And now that I got that purple in, I'm gonna do the same thing that I did on the lower half of the face, which is I'm gonna start pulling out warmer and cooler tones. And I can see right here that like the bridge of her eyebrows up here are a bit warmer. They almost have a bit of yellow, warm light reflected in them. So I'm gonna take a bit of lemon yellow and a tiny bit of alizarin crimson. And I'm gonna go back while this is still wet again and kind of suggest where those are. And I know that looks very dramatic right now, but again, kind of think of this like an underpainting. We're thinking about warms and cools, less so like what the exact mass tone of this color is. So I'm just gonna emphasize some of the parts of her forehead that are getting that reflected light from below her. Rather than, you know, obviously her skin isn't yellow or purple and it looks kind of funky right now. But it's gonna look really nice once we start layering colors over top of this and kind of getting the true skin tone that she has. We're gonna see just hints of this yellow beneath that, and it's gonna look really cool. And I'm even gonna put in a little bit more ultramarine up here where the shadow of her hat is casting down on her face. I'm gonna make sure that my brush is carrying a ton of water because I really wanna be working wet and wet here. We don't wanna be getting bogged down in the details yet. I'm just gonna start suggesting this dark shadow that her hat is casting down on her forehead. Even kind of getting into her ear over here, and maybe I'll even paint this whole, here, I'm working with a number 10 French quill right now. These are lovely brushes, I love using them. They're a little bit different shaped than your round brushes, but I'm gonna switch over to our 1-inch flat because I wanna get the whole under half of this hat in really quickly before this starts to dry. If you wanna get really even looking washes of color, you just gotta make sure that your color stays wet. You don't want like the edges of here to start drying, because as soon as they start drying, they'll start leaving a little bit of an edge that you want to avoid, which is why having brushes, again, that hold a lot of water is super important for watercolor, because you want to make sure you have enough time before it dries to be able to get all of the areas that you want to hit. So I'm going to come in and get the whole underside of her hat, and it's even kind of going off the edge of my canvas here. And I'm just painting this with straight ultramarine right now. Not much to it. Okay. Now I'm going to come in, I think I want to emphasize a bit more the shadow that her eyebrow is kind of casting down on her face. So I'm even going to pick up more of that ultramarine that I just had, and I'm going to stick it right into, whoop, I just got a little chunk of paint there, but that's okay. Scrub that out a little bit. Right into the concave of her eye. It looks really freaky right now on camera, I'm realizing. But everything will make a bit more sense once we start layering our colors a bit more. And I'm even gonna, I have a little bit too much water in this area because it's kind of building up in certain spots. So I want to make sure I get some of that out so it gets a more even consistency across the board. You can see here, basically looking at where the shadows of her face are the darkest. I might even come back up here and hit that again so I can get kind of the wrinkles of her face in. I think these areas are a little too prominent for what I want right now, so I'm gonna pull some of that out, just lift a little bit of it up, or even just smooth it out a bit so it's not as all over the place. And if you're working with watercolors and you get into details that you regret happening, just making sure it's wet and blotting with your cloth a little bit will pull that color right back up. And then if it's still wet, you can even things out again. And I'm not worried about inconsistencies right now. It kind of looks like, this is a total, I just looked at the camera and I realized she kind of looks like a bandit right now with like really small glasses on because of the shadows with her eyes. It looks a little funky at first. That's kind of how it is when you're layering up with watercolor, but I promise you it's all gonna even back out. I even probably wanna hit this again with a much darker tone because it's almost even in value to the face right now, but I'll come back to that once that first layer has dried. So moving back onto our face right here, I'm gonna switch back to my quill because again, I don't wanna get bogged down in tiny little details just yet, so I'm working with a slightly larger brush to kind of force me to think just about the shape of the face and the contours and where that kind of skin is moving. And the other thing too is when I chose this reference picture, something I really appreciated is that she has kind of all these wrinkles in her face that really help you see the contours of where her face is going. That's something that's really important to think about when you're painting this, is you kind of want to move your brush strokes with the contours of her face to get it in kind of a realistic structure. Yes.
Can you tell us where you found this reference photo?
Yes, I found it on unsplash.com. I should have linked it to our moderators. If they can't find it right now, then I will make sure to send it after the show ends so that we can post it on our Jerry's Live Facebook group. If you want to join our Jerry's Live Facebook group, you're more than welcome to. People post all kinds of art that they love there. If you want to post anything that you learned from the show, you're welcome to do it there. You just got to answer our security question and we'll let you in. Well, I'll make sure to post it there afterwards. And if our moderators can find it, then they will put it in the chat. But I'm going to come back to our face right here. You can see just how light this dried compared to our reference photo. I'm going to come back in and start layering even more color on top of that and kind of pulling out some of the details of these highlights. So I'm going to get a bit more of that alizarin crimson, a bit more of this yellow. I'm going to make sure there's more pigment to water ratio than there was before, so we're getting a more intense color. I'm even going to make sure I have a bit more of a wash there. Whoops. I just shot water across my whole face, but that's okay. This is what I mean. It's like when you're live painting and you're talking and you're thinking about what you're doing all at the same time. There's just like little things that you're like, I didn't mean to do that, but it's not the end of the world, like spraying myself in the face with water. But it happens. We prepared for these things. Okay. I think I want even more pigment in this than I had before. I personally prefer working from pans when I do watercolor, typically. But when one of the benefits of working straight from the tube is that you're able to get a darker mixture much faster, a higher pigment ratio much faster. That's part of the reason. And you can see too, I got a little bit of ultramarine stuck on the edge of my pan right here. I'm gonna pull some of that out so it doesn't get caught up in my mixture too much. And I'm gonna get some of that darker red tone, and I'm just gonna start emphasizing again the apples of her cheeks. That's what I was trying to say earlier, the apples of her cheeks. I'm pretty sure that's a phrase that people know. They're nodding at me. Okay, I'm not going crazy right now. Excellent. That's all that matters right now, is that Ma is not going insane. Okay, you can see I'm even gonna start pulling out some of the wrinkles of her face and some of the highlights that are happening in here. So I'm gonna keep this to the side so you guys can kind of keep track of what I'm doing. And I'm okay with all of those. Again, since she has so much texture in her skin, I'm okay with kind of like those crisp edges that I might want to blur out a little bit more if I'm drawing someone that has much smoother skin. And I'm even going to start emphasize a little bit of the highlights she gets down here on her mouth and on her lower lip here. You can see she has a little bit. Lots of people will have kind of like, what is it? Like your face will sink in a little bit after your bottom lip and before your chin, where it's kind of like the muscles of your lips are ending and then your jawbone, chin bone is sticking out a little bit more. You can see I was slowing down. My brain was working really hard to try and remember what any of those words were, so my hand was like, oh gosh. But yeah, so I like to try and emphasize. I'm losing it, guys. I'm not losing it. We're fine here. I like to try and emphasize that little bit gap between where the chin is and where like this little gap between the lip and the chin bone starts. See, I took biology for 4 years. I specialized in human anatomy and I don't know anything. I'm like, the job, blah, blah, blah. I'm not. So, go to college, I guess, is the lesson there. I don't know. Okay. This is why I became an art major, really. I'm even gonna come back here and start emphasizing this cheek on the other side of things, and just below our nose here. This area is in shadow. And really, I don't really need to be layering below it. I can come back with a darker color and get this whole shadow in, but just so I keep in mind where that shadow is below her nose, since it's a really prominent area of her face, I'm gonna cover it right there. And I'm even gonna make sure I'm getting all of the highlights and wrinkles that are happening on this side of her face. And I'm not really doing things exactly. I'm kind of suggesting at her wrinkles, but I'm not putting them in exactly. Because really you don't need to. You can if you like, if you want to go for like extreme realism, you can do that. But if I just want to get a good impression of her face and a good like form of her face, I don't need to go in and be like, okay, this wrinkle is exactly going this way, this one's exactly going that way. I'm kind of just suggesting at them and getting the form moving. So she has a little bit of highlight on the bridge of her nose here, and I'm gonna start putting in these strong wrinkles that are kind of suggesting at the form of her nose. And I'm even gonna start, I gotta make sure I get a little bit of this warmer tone under her eye. A little bit of the wrinkles that are moving there. I'm gonna come back in once I've done that and I get a little bit of this. And I'm gonna soften some of these edges up, because right now we have a lot of very hard edges going. And the beautiful thing of working loose or alla prima with watercolor is kind of switching between hard edge versus soft edge, which is just taking a clean wet brush and pulling away some of the pigment that's there, and kind of, I can even take my rag here and just, again, blot it down and pull some of that pigment up so I get a bit of a softer edge, or going back in and kind of suggesting at it again. Because that's like, that push and play between like a hard edge and a soft edge is really how you can start getting more visual interest in your painting. And I even lost some of the highlight on her cheek there, so I might come back and pull that out again. Again, she has a very textured skin tone, so I'm kind of okay with my rag creating a little bit of texture in her face as well. I even might come back over here and do the same on this side. I'm just lifting a bit more of that color. You want to make sure too that when you're doing this, you're not taking your brush and pushing from the darker area into the light. If you want to widen your highlights out, you want to make sure you're coming from the highlight and pushing into the dark so that you're not pushing all of that excess pigment straight into your highlight. I'm going to pull a little bit more of that up, and I might even come back and add a little bit, while this is still wet, a little bit of more of this alizarin crimson into her rosy cheeks here. You can see I picked up a little bit too much, blah blah. I can't talk. I never can talk, but we're good. A little bit too much pigment, and so it got a little bit chunky on my paint here, but I can easily even that out while my paint is still wet. And then I'm going to come back and do the same on this cheek, so she doesn't just have one rosy cheek. I'm pushing, again, kind of an interplay between wet, and then once we get all of the general shape of her features down, that's when we can start going in and getting more specific details. Now, I'm going to come back up here to the top. It's still looking really freaky right now, but everything's going to even out as we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get kind of what I think is closer to what her true skin tone would be, and I'm going to go over this entire area of shadow with it so we can get a more even tone across her face, and then our underpainting and those colors that we threw down here are really going to start to shine through in a subtler way than it is right now. She's looking very colorful right now. So I'm going to get a darker tone since this is just shadow. And the wonderful thing is if you picked out a good set of primaries, then the three of them mixed together will make a really nice neutral shadow tone. You kind of have to play with the ratios that will create that, because like yellow, since it has such a delicate value, sometimes you need to add a bit more of it to be able to get a good neutral tone, because it is kind of overpowered by your magenta and your cyan or your red and blue or whatever you would like to call it. And I'm going to make sure that this is a slightly warmer tone so it still suggests her skin tone, but that it's dark so it's getting that shadow in there. Okay, again, a bit more of that yellow, and I still want it to be cool. This is really all that painting is just boop, boop, boop. It's like you're kind of like a printer working here, just picking up a little bit more of this color, a little bit more of that color, seeing what will work. Okay, I think we're getting a bit closer to what I want here. Actually, that's pretty good. I like that cooler. I'm jumping between like, do I want this warm or do I want this cool? And really that's kind of up to personal preference, because you can interpret this either way. That's part of the thing with warm and cool, is that it kind of depends on your own personal style and your own personal taste, whether you want certain areas of shadow to be warm or cool. Lots of artists tend to, I don't think this is quite as dark as I want it to be. Lots of artists tend to put shadows in the cool when they're starting out, and then their highlights will be a bit warmer. And that's a nice, easy way to think about it, because that's often the time true. But I think it's important as you start growing as an artist, or if you just want to challenge yourself a bit, start depicting things where it's like the highlights are cool and the shadows are warm, and kind of thinking about that push and pull a little bit differently. And this isn't quite as dark as I need it to be. I need to start getting darker a lot faster, because you know, you always want to start out light with watercolors, but you can't be afraid to go dark quickly. So I'm gonna just pick up whole chunks of paint right here, and I'm gonna start throwing it in there and really getting my shadow down. And I gotta make sure I don't get any chunkies of tube paint. Make sure it's evened out in my wash. Okay, and this is still wet, so I can even just come on top of it and put it back in. And the only thing I gotta be careful about is those little crisp edges where the shadow ends. But everything else can kind of be thrown in pretty quickly. Okay. I'm gonna start pulling this up into the hat. I'm not gonna focus too much on the hat right now since we're on limited time. I'm still gonna make sure it's in shadow, and her ear back here is even in shadow, so I'm gonna pull that down a little bit. I'm going to try to focus on our facial features so that you guys can really see how to build them up. And I actually want to know how many of you guys out there are portrait artists, or if you specifically like portraiture. I don't really think of myself as a portrait artist. I know Emmy really likes portrait painting. This is a bit of a mouthful saying portrait a million different times. But if you can draw a human figure, you can really draw anything. And I know it feels very self-centered to say, because it's not like the world revolves around humans or anything, but we have such complicated and strange anatomy that it's like, if you can get that down, you're probably good. And lots of times, you know, we're humans, so most of our art depicts humans, because that's what we want to see. And so if you draw a lot of figures, if you draw a lot of faces, it will help you drawing other things and thinking about other things in a more three-dimensional and dynamic way. So again, I gotta get darker fast. And I put that first layer of shadow down, and I think I want to even go over it again. But you can start to see here how a little bit of that yellow and a little bit of that blue is starting to even out a little bit, look a little more natural, but still kind of shine through. So, this paint is getting thick because I'm throwing in tons of wet paint very quickly. And I'm even dripping a little bit on here. But that's okay. We're working loose right now. Okay. I got Bic. This is just like, you could make a whole compilation of all the words that I weirdly pronounce on this show while I'm like trying to paint and talk at the same time. Bic is definitely one of them when I was trying to say big, and I don't even know quite what I was going with that thought prior to that, because the fact that I said Bic really distracted me and pulled me out of that. Apologies. Okay. Getting the shadow of the ear down, getting this whole shadow of the hat in very quickly. And that's starting to be, it's still not nearly as dark as I want it to, but it's starting to get a little bit closer. We might not even be able to get that quite where I want it to be, because I think I'm going to start, after this has dried, I'm going to start putting more fine details in so you guys can watch me do that. Even though if I was running on more time, I would go through and add darker and darker washes to this so I could really get that deep depth of that shadow in. But again, I'm gonna go back, layer on top of this again, and start pulling out that next layer of highlights that's kind of hidden in her skin and suggesting a bit more of the wrinkles that are there. And that's really all you have to do with watercolors. Think of it layer by layer. The next layer of darkness or lightness, whichever way you want to think of it, and how that's gonna come through in their face. I gotta make sure I'm getting a lot of this alizarin. Really, I think most of the time I spend painting, especially if I'm working with primaries, is just on mixing color. It's not even about putting paint down necessarily. Maybe it's kind of relaxing though, just mixing the colors together. You kind of get into the swing of it. Okay. I think that's still too light for what I want. I feel like there's still a bit too much water to pigment there. So I'm really just trying to get as much of this in here quickly, and I still want it to be warm. It's a little bit too cool right now. And this right here, all of this mixing and sloshing around that I'm doing right here in my tray, it's really helpful. If you're messy like me when you're mixing, working with primers is very helpful, because generally the more pigments that you mix, the messier your colors tend to come out, or like the grainier they tend to come out. And if you want really bright, saturated colors, it's best to mix with less pigments. And so working with primers is kind of a way to avoid that. If like, oh, I accidentally threw some color in there that I didn't mean to get in there, but it's okay because I'm only working with 3 colors, so I know what pigments are in there and I know I'm not gonna get carried away with pigments. I think I'm gonna pull a little bit of that out of the nose because I'm working with just a little bit too much water on my brush. And the reason I know that is just from feel. So practicing with watercolor is how you're going to be able to feel a bit more like, do I have too much water on my brush right now? Do I not have enough? Am I creating almost like a bright, dry brush texture? That's another one you can add to the list besides Bic is Bry. Apparently I just add B's to the beginning of words. I have an ongoing list in my head right now of words that I've pronounced funny on this. It's kind of fun. Okay. But part of that, as you can see here, I'm working with a very wet brush and those pigments are starting to gather on the edges of her faces. So I'm going to have to go back in since I'm almost working with too much water right now for the fine amount of detail that I'm starting to get. I'm gonna have to take some of that out, which is easy enough to do. I'm just gonna go back over those areas that had a little bit too much, and I'm just gonna pull it right out. I think a lot of people fear watercolors. That's another one. Add it to the list. A lot of people fear watercolors because they feel like it's hard to get details with them, or that water is very hard to control. And I think something that people need to remember to kind of calm themselves down a little bit when they're working with watercolors is that as long as it's wet, it's workable. You can edit things. As long as it's wet, you can pull them up. You know, just make sure you're not working with colors that are very staining. A lot of brands will tell you whether a color is staining. Like lots of phthalo colors will stain really bad. So as long as you're not working with staining colors, things are workable once you throw them down. And if you're working with a brush that holds a lot of water, things will stay wet for a while, so you'll have plenty of working time. I know if you're coming from like oil painting or things like that, that can be kind of intimidating because it feels like things are moving a lot faster than it does with oils. But really, just make sure your brush is loaded up. If you need to spritz it with the water bottle, do so. And then you'll get plenty of working time for what you need to do. Just take it nice and slow and you'll be good. I'm starting to get a little bit of strange textures on the edge here since I had a little bit too much water. I'm starting to get that kind of broccoli effect that's happening. Cauliflower effect, that's what it's called. Cauliflower effect, not broccoli. So you can't add that one to the list because I got words mixed up. I didn't say something funny, so don't add that to the list. I'm saying this mostly to myself. I hope none of you are actually writing down a list right now. If you are...
What you don't know, Ma, is that we already have a list of Emmy's technical words that are super technical and only for art.
Like what?
I don't remember. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Just have to add yours to it.
Yeah.
You're just gonna have to add... It's like Emmy's technical words that she made up and my words that I can't seem to pronounce correctly. It's just on a list somewhere, apparently, that my coworkers will hold against me my whole life. Yeah, please don't actually keep a list in the comments. Go back and delete it if you did, because I'll look at it and cry. I'm kidding, of course, but... Okay, I'm getting a bit of that cauliflower effect. Oftentimes that can happen when your brush has a little bit too much water in it and it's trying to push its way out of the area that you've painted. So all I'm doing, again, as long as it's wet, it's workable, is coming back and kind of picking up those edges and evening them out a little bit. There's another one you can add to the list. Oh my gosh, I'm really like, it's worse when I think about it. It's only getting worse now that I'm thinking about it a lot. Okay. It's cool. That's getting a little bit closer to where I want. And this is really wet. I'm gonna dry this with our blow dryer really quickly. I think our sound should cut out, but if it's really loud, apologies, so that I can start going in and getting a little bit more of the fine details so we can see what this is actually gonna look more or less like as it gets finished. So, blow dryer is going on now. I believe that should be dry enough to get our little details in. That's something that's very important if you're switching from large washes to details. You want to make sure it's completely dry, otherwise you're going to start getting bleeding on your tiny little details and that's going to be very frustrating. I just used a blow dryer to dry that really quickly. I actually learned recently that apparently some people find it like, I guess contentious to use a blow dryer when you're watercolor painting because it can, they say, damage the fibers of the paper over time, which I feel like is something that's very specific if you're being extremely careful about archivability, which is not a word, but it should be, and how, you know, how long this is going to last. It's what?
It is around here.
It is around here, yes. I just learned that recently. I thought that was so funny because I do it all the time. I think it's similar to like, if you blow dry your hair every single day, then your hair is going to get damaged over time, which makes sense. So I guess just don't blow dry your painting a million times. Someone will have to tell me if they've heard that somewhere before, because I only heard that recently, and I've been doing it for so long that I'm like, should I be doing this? I'm not sure anymore. But for the sake of speed, we're doing it. Okay, what I'm doing right now is I'm mixing up a much darker shadow color that I'm going to be using to get some of these more obvious features in, so we can start getting a more complete painting. And I'm running out of my alizarin crimson and my ultramarine. So I'm going to pour a little bit more of that back in. You can even see here, the slight texture that's happening is the granulation of the ultramarine. Something I really like about this Maurice is that any color you mix with the ultramarine, especially the alizarin crimson, kind of separates a bit when you're, I know that sounds bad, but it's really cool effect. So if any of you like are a big fan of the Schmincke granulating color line, I know a lot of people really love them. Some of them have almost a dual color effect, where the pigments will separate a little bit when you put them down and create a cool texture. This ultramarine and this alizarin crimson from Maurice do that, and it's really cool. I like it a lot. So it's happening a little bit in here. Okay, but I was mixing a dark tone. I'm not gonna let myself get too distracted. I love granulating colors. They're so much fun. I was experimenting the other day with mixing these two colors. And like, these two colors plus like a third, I think it was like a burnt sienna. It made a really cool brown. Highly recommend. Alizarin crimson, ultramarine, and a burnt sienna from Maurice Masters. It creates a really nice brown color. So if you want to experiment with that, go for it. Okay. I'm getting a bit of a darker brown in there. I think that's going to be good for just starting to suggest my shadows. And I'm going to get this one really prominent one that's underneath her nose. You can see it's coming down and it's just touching the very tip of her mouth. And something that I think is really cool about it is that sometimes at the very edges of a shadow, you'll see a much intenser version of the mass tone of the color. And by that, I mean, you can barely see it on this reference image, but this shadow is coming down and hitting her lips right here. And since she has this more pink lip, it's almost like a straight magenta that's right there on the edge of her lip that's being caused by the shadow cast down. And it's so subtle, but I feel like little details like that can really add when you're doing realistic portraiture, or really any kind of portraiture, just playing with color a little bit to add a little bit more dimension to it can be super fun. And I like little details like that. Like you can even see it a bit on the edge of her eyes here. There's almost a really bright red that happens right before. It's so subtle. It is so light. You can see it a little bit right there, and then a little bit on the top of her lip down here. Just like tiny details like that, once you start noticing them, can be really fun to play with. But I'm going to start getting these really prominent shadows that come from the apples of her cheeks casting down. And I'm just working with what is essentially a dark brown right now. So kind of getting that warmer color coming through. And the way I mix that is just mostly an alizarin crimson, a lot of lemon yellow, and then just a bit of ultramarine to kind of get this more dark brown tone coming in. And I'm even going to start putting it in on the apple of her cheek right there where the shadow's really curving, and making sure I get some of those really crisp details on the bottom of the shadow where her skin's wrinkling, because that's going to help add a lot of form and structure to this part of her face. But then on the upper half of this shadow, if I can get this filled in really quickly, I'm actually going to take my brush, make sure it's wet and clean, and I'm just gonna get a little more water to it, and I'm just gonna pull it out just a little bit and make it just a little bit softer. I'll even push it back in after I've done that. That's kind of how I like to make soft edges. I'll pull out the shadow a little bit, and then I'll push it back in so it doesn't keep spreading farther than I want it to. So I'm gonna push that out. And then I'm gonna make sure that I get it again on this side. There's not quite as dark of a shadow, but there's still a little bit coming up on this edge. So I'm gonna put it in, and that's a little bit darker than I want it to be, but I'm gonna come back in with my brush really quickly and just kind of soften it out. And I can even come back in and kind of lift up this edge a little bit so it's not as crisp. It's a little bit soft. And I'll use the bottom half to try and suggest some of these wrinkles. And then I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna try to get her mouth really quickly, because she looks kind of funky right now without her mouth. So I find when I'm painting mouths, The part that I like to paint most is like right on the edges of your mouth right here, because I find they tend to pit a little bit and have a little bit more of a cast shadow than the rest of the mouth. So she has that, especially on this edge. There's this edge of the shadow where the lips are ending and curving up is pretty prominent. So I'm going to throw that in really quick. And then I'm just going to start suggesting this little bitty shadow that's cast by her upper lip. And it kind of curves down a little bit, and then it almost curves back up. She's not quite frowning. She has kind of a neutral expression, but her lips are very much like curving in a way that's down and then back up again. So I'm going to pay very close attention to that, because the shape of your mouth can really drastically change the expression that you're trying to emote, I guess is the word. And it took me a really long time when I was learning how to paint portraiture, just how to get that mouth exactly where I want it to. Because I found lots of times I would be putting too much emphasis on the upper lip to the point where their mouth would almost look strange or larger than I intended it to. So lots of times now I will like hint at the shadow that's coming across the top of the mouth, and if they have a really prominent upper lip, then I'll suggest at that too. But if they don't, like this woman does, then I'll only suggest the bottom of the bottom lip and where that cast shadow kind of is from it. And I find that helps it look a little bit more natural and a little bit more neutral. And if I really want to suggest, like if I want to suggest a more masculine face, then I'll make sure not to, like, this is something I've noticed in my own art, which I guess might be something that's distinct about my own style, that could be drastically different for yours. But I find when I'm drawing more masculine figures, I like to not emphasize the upper lip too much. Because when I emphasize the upper and lower lip, even if that person has a very prominent upper lip, it almost looks like very feminine for some reason, which I think is a part of my own style. So, I don't know, that's something I've noticed. Let me know if you've noticed something similar, or if there's something similar to that in your own style. When you're drawing portraiture, you're like, I just don't like to emphasize that part, because it doesn't feel like, if I find this person to be super masculine, I feel like that detracts from the energy that I'm trying to give them. Not that, like, the fact that they have a prominent upper lip makes them less masculine, just like the way you depict it on paper kind of changes the way it feels to you. I hope I'm making sense when I try to explain that. It's just little things that like that can kind of help you start forming your own style. And sometimes it's really subtle, even if you're a realist painter and you think, oh, I don't have a defined style, like no one would be able to pick mine from a lineup of other realist painters. There's little things like that where it's like people will start to be able to tell, like, oh, you don't like to emphasize this certain feature of a face. And sometimes you're not even really conscious of that. It took me a long time to realize that that was what was feeling off about my pictures, is how I drew the upper lip, and that's so specific. So I've got the lower face a little bit more to what I want it to. If I had more time, I'd come back and emphasize the apples of her cheeks a little bit more, but I'm gonna start quickly adding a bit more shadow into our upper half here, so you guys can see that towards the end. And we are coming close on time, so if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to ask me. I'm happy to answer them, whether it's about working with watercolors in portraiture, or working with the shadows of the face and everything, or just the shapes of the face and how you would construct them. I know we had some people in a previous class I taught request a lesson on perspective, and perspective is something that can be super handy when you're working with portraiture and trying to figure out how like the shadow is going to affect this part of the face, or like where your highlights are and everything. So if you guys want a lesson on perspective, let us know. It might be something that we can get in early next year. Okay, so I got kind of this purple tone. I think I'm just going to start very quickly hinting at some of the details, like this part of her eye right there. And I might even come in really quickly. I don't think I'm going to do too much justice to the upper half of her face in the little time that I have right now, but I'm just going to emphasize them really lightly, and then I think I'm going to come in and I'm going to build up some of the shadow that her face is casting onto her shirt and around her neck here, because I find that that part of it can really help define her facial features a bit more. Like, highlights only work in the context of shadows when you think about it. So I like starting before the face is officially done, I like to put some of those shadows around the face in. And I'm going to switch to a slightly larger brush. This is a number 8 round, so I can throw that in really quickly. So I think I want a cool dark shadow. So I'm going to add a bit more ultramarine into my mixture, and then I'm just going to come around the bottom here I start cleaning up this edge of her face a bit. I start building out that shadow a bit more so that you can really see that her face is being hit by light. And honestly, like, this is, if I were to keep going with this, it would really just be much more of the same, just layering, 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 and thinking about where my darker darks lie and avoiding the areas that are in light. So I'm gonna hit this corner of her neck really quick. And then on this side of her face, she has this braid that kind of gets mixed in with the shadow on this side of her face. So I'm gonna make sure I hint at that a little bit as well. And you can see how at the beginning of this, when I was just throwing colors down, it looked very strange, but it's starting to look much more like a realistic face. And if I were to keep going with this, things would start getting a lot more realistic and rounding out a lot more as I went. Even though I threw in like some crazy colors in here, like straight ultramarine and yellow into the top of her forehead, they're still there. You can still see hints of them, like where her brow ridge is kind of jutting out. You can still see a little bit of hint of it there, but it's not as obnoxiously yellow as it was when we first started out. And it's just kind of building like that and thinking of watercolor much like you would as glazing in oil painting if you're coming from an oil painting background. Essentially, that's all watercolor is just building up glazes.
Ma.
Yes.
If you had to just hazard a guess, because I know you won't be able to finish it now.
Yeah.
How many layers would you think you'd have to use to finish this portrait to your satisfaction?
To my satisfaction? That really depends, I guess. It's hard because we say a lot in painting that, like, it's done when it's done, you know? Like, it's never really done, but it's done when you say it's done. And so if I wanted to end this right now and say it's done, it could be done. Like, this could be my final piece. I could also keep going for 1,000 more layers before I declare that it's done. So it's really up to what my personal preference is or what the artist's personal preference is. For me personally, I've been working a lot looser with my watercolors recently and trying to get a realistic look without getting into too many like nitty-gritty details, because I find that's kind of where my style tends to be going. And so I'd probably only do maybe 1 or 2 more layers. It really depends if I can get these darker darks, these darkest shadows where I want them to be, because I want it to be close to what it is in the reference photo, and it is nowhere near that right now. Like, even the part of her face that is in light needs to be a lot darker to be able to match this accurately. So I'd say maybe 2 or 3 more layers if I can get that where I want it to be. But as soon as I can get those darkest darks in, that's probably when I would call it. Because I'm starting to like hint a little bit at the wrinkles in her face and hint a little bit at the darkest darks, and that's really what I need to get to. So it really depends, I guess, on what your personal preference is. But unfortunately, that is all we have time for tonight. Thank you guys so much for coming today. Again, our class code is JL309 if you want to find any of the supplies that we used tonight. And I did mention the Facebook live group that we have on Facebook, of course. So if you want to join that, make sure you answer the security question, and then we'll let you in and you can show us all of your wonderful art that you have. Next week is a Facebook only show. It's going to be Pan Pastels. The title is Pan Pastels, What Are They For Anyway? With Dawn Emberson, who is a wonderful pastel artist. So make sure you check us out there. And I hope you guys had a great time tonight. If you had any questions that weren't answered, if you think of anything else after this, I will be going back through the questions tomorrow and answering them, so don't fret. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week. Bye!